You're listening to Robinson Ventures Radio, where ingenuity meets innovation. Good afternoon. Hope everyone is having a wonderful day. I'm today's host, Tucker Robinson, and I'm joined by none other than Robinson Ventures president and founder, Cian Robinson. How are you doing today?
Hey, good morning, Tucker. I'm doing great. Sitting here in South Carolina, and it's a typical summer afternoon where it got really hot in the morning, and now we're waiting for the thunderstorms.
A nice bit of humidity to cool things down.
Yes, that's right. A little bit more humidity, but having recently lived in Louisiana and specifically Lafayette, Louisiana, this is not humid compared to a Louisiana summer heat and humidity.
So speaking of, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and a bit about Robinson Ventures?
So, Tucker, I grew up primarily in the New York, New Jersey, upstate New Jersey area, a little place called Newton, Sparta, Andover, Sussex County. Spent my school year during, you know, in that community, going to public high school there, public schools, and then in the summers would often visit Western Pennsylvania and visit my family out there. And the side of the family I identify most with is my mom's side of the family. And they are from a little town called Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania, which is about 50, 60 miles south of the Pittsburgh area. The joke I use is all my friends when I was back in Jersey were Giants, Jets, perhaps Eagles fans if you follow the NFL. I was and remain a diehard Pittsburgh Steelers fan. The joke I used is my baby blanket was a terrible towel. And so I follow the Steelers very, very closely. Spent and that Western Pennsylvania upbringing, hard work, strong moral center, strong ethics, and very much an entrepreneurial spirit was born from that area of the country. If you look at Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania, my mom's maiden name is spelled Etze, pronounced Eats. There is a street in town named for us. That's because my great uncle Sam was the mayor. But that family also started the local grocery store, worked and brought the Woolworths. If anybody ever remembers a Woolworths, brought Woolworths to town. My great aunt was the first female manager of a Woolworths. And so there's a lot of really good, solid entrepreneurial roots that run through that side of the family, which is for me the Italian side of the family. So much so that after high school, I went to St. Vincent College. It's a Benedictine Catholic private liberal arts school where I majored in mathematics and have a minor in history. And then from there, in between undergrad and grad, spent almost 2 years working various different jobs. I worked as a laborer in construction. I worked on a farm as a laborer. I worked in office settings honestly got my start as an executive assistant professionally at AT&T that then turned into an opportunity to use my mathematics degree and my love for computer science and software development. And then that led me to, after a time, going to Carnegie Mellon University. I would consider Carnegie Mellon one of the top schools in this nation. And, up there with everybody thinks of the Harvards and the MITs and the UC Berkeleys. I really think Carnegie Mellon is right there in that group. And then Carnegie Mellon, I got my degree in management, specifically public policy and administration, and my concentrations were finance and budgeting. And then from there, left Carnegie Mellon. But before doing that, met my future wife, who is at the time of leaving Carnegie Mellon, became my fiance, Dr. Natalie Harder, who is the first female president of Coker University and the reason why we live in South Carolina today. And then from there, worked for the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue, managing $1.8 billion motor license fund. So essentially, anytime you would go to the pump and buy gasoline, or if you were a truck driver, diesel fuel, you have to pay state fuel tax. And those fuel taxes would come into the Department of Revenue. It was my job to do the econometric modeling that was associated with the collection. and of those taxes. And those taxes then went to fund the Department of Transportation as well as the state police. And so at the ripe old age of 24, I was managing $1.8 billion for the state of Pennsylvania and having to negotiate two budget cycles, one under a Democrat and one under a Republican governor, but two budget cycles to put the budgets together for the Department of Transportation, the state troopers. And what was great was going before the House and the Senate and the governor's office to then triangulate all those and get those to reconcile to pass a full budget. Then left Harrisburg, which is where the Department of Revenue was, went to Buffalo, New York to get married to Dr. Harder. And there we started a family. We have two boys. I think you're one of them, named Tucker Robinson.
That
But
would be a factual statement.
and then the other one is your younger brother, Rory Robinson. And so we had you guys up in Buffalo, New York. Dr. Harder worked in economic development and higher education. And I worked in a combination of finance, information technology as the really the and healthcare as the three primary focus areas. And Tucker, what I found was I was hired to solve a problem, or right. I was never hired to do a job. Somebody was always creating a job to solve a problem that they saw within the organization. And so what would happen would be when I moved to Buffalo, New York, I got hired by M&T Bank, and what they needed was somebody to help them analyze and set their indirect lending rates. And so I became a fiscal revenue analyst one, indirect lending specialist. And so my job was to collect a whole bunch of data, comb through that data, and then recommend interest rates that then went out to places like car dealerships to have those car dealerships know that they had a bank that was willing to buy a note, buy a loan from somebody who came in to buy a new car or a used car. And so really started to, in addition to the Department of Revenue in Pennsylvania, started to hone my skills on how do you take massive amounts of information, chunk it all together, and make, well, it's actually massive amounts of data and chunk it all together to create information. My work there got noticed by a company that was no longer in existence. It was acquired by a company called Diebold. It was Verdi Ryan and Associates at the time, and I moved into their work to do that type of how do you not only take internal data that you're trying to comb through and create information, but how do you also take market-based data? How do you take consumer interviews? How do you take multiple disparate data sets, bring it all together to create a recommendation for your client? And in this instance, Verdi Ryan and Associates clients were banks. And so worked there for about 18 to 24 months before the company transitioned. And in fact, it was my first real experience watching a company be split and sold. Verdi Ryan Associates got split into Verdi Associates and Ryan Associates because the two owners came to an understanding that they couldn't work together anymore, that they were heading in different directions, so they split the company. Ryan and Associates, I never knew whatever happened with them, but Verdi Associates was then acquired by Diebold, and there was some really good work that I ended up doing there. Worked with a young man named Jeffrey Sullivan. Sully is no longer with us. He passed away from cancer. But Sully and I worked together creating a 7-digit unique identifier that when we would look at all the data on a person who would come into the bank, we would be able to tell what their banking patterns were going to be and how we can drive them to different banking delivery channels. From there, I became the coordinator of strategic planning for Roswell Park Cancer Institute. And so that was my first real formal foray into working into a health system. They were moving from being part of the New York State Department of Health to their own hospital system, to their own nonprofit public benefit corp, and had the honor to work with them as they moved that thinking through. And again, it was how do you collect data and how do you analyze that data to create a delivery system that helps care for people with cancer. And what you may not know is at the time, Roswell Park was known as the place of last resort that you went to. You only went there if you had no other, you've gone through all the available treatments and now there are only clinical trials. When in fact, if you had gone there first, you might have had a better chance because you were already connected to that continuum of care. And so working with a team of folks there, we came up with the tagline of think life, think positive, think Roswell. And it stuck. And now Roswell is a premier cancer center. And it was back in the day, but it is even more so now. After Roswell Park moved into working in economic development and a trade association space, really focused on getting these. And again, it was always come in and solve a problem. It's not a job, it was a problem. And then the same thing with working with, at the time, it was named the Buffalo Niagara Partnership. I came in as their chief information officer and eventually became their chief information and operations officer. And Tucker, I was all 29 years old when this was happening. And what their major problem was they had a few folks that didn't know how to get them through Y2K, right? The year 2000 conversion. And so I spent 18 months there getting them upset, running, and ready for the coming economy, which was going to be hyper dependent upon on internet and internet enabled technologies. And after that point in time of working for Buffalo Niagara Enterprise and then helping a group of folks start an entity called Infotech Niagara, which is now known as Infotech Western New York, as a trade association for technology companies, it became pretty clear to me that every probably 18 to 24 months, I was either moving to another job or more likely being recruited to go to another job to solve a problem. And along the way, those solutions generated both wealth and social impact and positive social impact. And so that's how in 2002, I started Robinson Ventures. You were four, almost four, and Rory was on the way. And we had just left Buffalo to move out to Orchard Park, New York. And here I am, a new dad, right? I have you. I've got my second son on the way. I'm leaving a really good job to start my own company. And so the phrase I use, it's the phrase of you do it scared, right? It doesn't mean you do it, and there's a fine line between stupid and brave. And doing it scared means you've thought it through, you've analyzed the situation, you might still be a little uncertain, you might still be, a little trepidatious, but you do it anyway. You take that leap of faith, and what you believe in is you believe in yourself and the folks that are surrounded by you. And I say for surrounded, I'm talking if you're in a relationship, your partner has your back, right? And so again, hyper specific to you and I, right now, I made sure mom, Dr. Harder, was okay with it. And she was more than okay. She was like, I want you to do this. I'll help support this. Right. But again, we were we were dual income, two kids, a brand new mortgage. And that also meant that I had a monthly nut I had to crack to get to the house. And so as long as that conversation was had, we had, mom and I had that, but you have to have that with your partner because if it's not good at home, it's not going to be good anywhere else. And then, we started Robinson Ventures. And I hope maybe one day Mike Hassett hears this. And the way Robinson Ventures came about was, this is going to sound terrible, but I called him up because Mike's a dear friend, remains a dear friend. And he had just successfully exited a startup, which was one of the first internet dial-up services, ISPs, in Buffalo's history. And I called him up and I said, "This is what I'm thinking of doing." And so I went over his house, and Mike had an amazing bar in his basement. And we sat there, and honest to God, we drank tequila shots. We were like, "Well, what are we going to name this thing, and what is it going to do?" And so ended up having a few tequila shots, and it started off as he looks at me and goes, "You always have these great adventures." And I'm like, "I do, don't I?" And we have adventures together. We've had adventures together, huh, Mike? Mike looked at me and he goes, "But you also like investing in stuff." He goes, "You invest in people, you invest in companies, you invest in all kinds of different things." And that's how we got the name Robinson Ventures. So we took it from Cian Robinson has really interesting adventures to we needed to squish it together. And this is Mike's brilliant brain. And it became Robinson Ventures. Well, at first it was Cian Robinson doing business as Robinson Ventures. But eventually our family attorney, who was also a very good small business attorney, Lawrence Schwach, went into his office one day and he goes, "Man, we need to form you as an LLC to protect the assets of the family." And so that's where Robinson Ventures was born in 2002. And I promised Dr. Harder, I promised mom that if I did not within 6 months have enough money to have that monthly requirement going to the house, that I would stop it and I would go get a job. Immediately it turned into something that I never expected, which was I had people calling me saying, "Hey, we need you to do this. Hey, we need you to come in and do that." And it all ties back to the fact that people always wanted me to come in and help them solve a problem.
Yeah, you were able to take your inherent ability to see a problem and fix it with a solution that lasts, and you were able to take that and turn it from hopping between firm and company to firm and company, and creating a space where you can do it on your time and pick and choose which ones you think are worthy of your time.
Agreed. And early on, less pick and choose and more they wanted to pay me, and I was good. And I was good. No, I was good, but I was good with that, right? And so I made some mistakes there. There were some times where I undervalued the value I was bringing to the table, and so I underpriced my services. And I hate that to this day when you leave money on the table. It's a pet peeve. Like if you structure a contract and then somehow you realize, oh, they would have paid an extra $1,000 a month, or they would have paid an extra so many dollars an hour, or so much for the project, right? Still boils my blood. But used it to get started. And what was interesting was I was hyper focused on investing and information technology. But what never occurred to me was this whole side of the non for profit house that showed up. And people had me coming in and saying, "Hey, would you write grants for us? Didn't you write a $3 million grant for Infotech Niagara at the time, now Western New York, to help us with workforce development?" Well, I sure did. Didn't you get another so many $1 million also for workforce? Yes, I did. Didn't you? And so all of a sudden I was getting these folks calling me up and saying, we need somebody to help us manage our grant writing process and construct grants. And so all of a sudden I found that what I could do is I was really good at structuring, coming up with the program, taking an existing program and ingesting it. Um, but then I'm dyslexic, right? Writing's painful, like massively painful, right? And so what I was able to do was find some really good folks in the local community they loved writing. They enjoyed writing. And not only, and some grants you write are very technical, right? So you have to be spot on and hyper technical. And some of them you can be a little bit more flowery in your language, right? Um, but man, just was able to out of nowhere. Oh my gosh, I had an entire small little division of Robinson Ventures that was chunking out workforce development grants, private foundation grants, federal, state grants. Never expected it. And that turned into one client said, "Hey, you really have a head. Can you help us facilitate our strategic planning process?" And sure enough, guess what? Now we started doing strategic plans for non for profits. Then we started doing fund development plans for non for profits. All of a sudden, this entire division of Robinson Ventures showed up that I never had heard. I never even thought of coming out of the box. And so, what I say to us, folks who've started up companies, is you're going to have your primary product set that you're going to go to market with. But man, listen to the client. And if you have the ability to, within your skill set or your product set, deliver value, you do it all day long, just as long as it doesn't go completely bonkers and off of the focus of the company, right? And you're always, as a small business, going to have, in a good entrepreneur and a successful entrepreneur, a little skunk works that's either in your own brain or you're working with a small group of folks on your team that are trying to develop new service or products offering. And so that was Robinson Ventures. And the next thing you know, it was going strong, like, to the point where I was working between 80 and 100 hours a week. And then Dr. Harder, AKA Mom, one day sat down and, sat me down and said, you're going to burn yourself out. You need to start hiring some 1099 contractors. And sure enough, that's what I started doing, to the point in time when, when we moved the firm to Virginia. And I hope people understand that what we were able to do through this flexibility with Robinson Ventures is my career path went like on a J hook. It just went skyrocketed. Whereas Dr. Harder, her path was steady and sort of on a nice slope. And so she went from higher education in upstate New York to higher education in central Virginia to higher education in Louisiana, and now higher education in South Carolina. But what Robinson Ventures did was it afforded the flexibility to continue to virtually run a boutique, anywhere from $1.5 to $3 million a year firm that employed, a group of 1099s, gave us the flexibility to have just a wonderful, quality of life. And, I'm sure you probably remember, there were times where you had to come up to my office in Orchard Park above the garage when we started Robinson Ventures to sit and hang out while I was on the phone talking to clients. I do believe in your kindergarten class, you literally wrote, mom works for the college, dad talks on the phone, and that was the description of our jobs. And so,
For a kindergartner, I feel like that's pretty spot on.
well, it's what you saw, right? What does dad do all day long? He talks on the phone a lot. He must talk on the phone for a living. But then we moved the firm from upstate New York. And to be honest with you, part of the calculus was the regulatory overburden and the taxation overburden in New York had become so onersome for a small business owner that moving to Virginia made a ton of sense. I mean, we were putting 5 figures a year back in our pockets in taxes just making that move. Plus, then it gave me some additional freedom and our proximity to burgeoning marketplaces like the Golden Crescent of Baltimore, D.C., Richmond, Tidewater area in Virginia, Greensboro, North, that area, Raleigh, Durham. I mean, just these marketplaces that were blowing up. But Robinson Ventures continued to do really well. And then in 2012, we decided to move to Louisiana, right? And so what was really interesting was at the same time, I had a firm that we were competing with in the marketplace. They were out of Richmond and they came to me and said, we're tired of competing with you in the marketplace. And so that firm made me a proposal that allowed us to move to Louisiana, and my book of business was acquired. And so that acquisition afforded us some pretty interesting opportunities. And so I completed that transaction in 2012, went to Lafayette, Louisiana, and that's when I put Robinson Ventures in dormancy. And partly for the reason of I had signed a non-compete. So part of the structure of the acquisition was a 3-year structured payout. And then after that 3-year structured payout completed, a 5-year non-compete. And so Robinson Ventures went into dormancy. And so while that 8-year period, while we were in Lafayette, Louisiana, I was very blessed to work as an employee with UL Lafayette, University of Louisiana Lafayette, go Cajuns. Worked in their research department, working on 2 computer science-based research centers. One NSF funded, which was just a phenomenal experience, but then had the pleasure of coming to know the president and CEO of Lafayette General Health, which is now known as Auctioner Lafayette General, Mr. David Calicod, who afforded me the opportunity to come work for the health system. And there I was able to be essentially Robinson Ventures inside a health system, right? So I knew non-for-profit management because of the division we had, and so I was able to help them with the foundation. I knew real estate and real estate transactions and structures. I was able to help them with that. I was able to help them with research because I was able to UL Lafayette. And where my passion remains is with entrepreneurship. And so I got to be an entrepreneur, asking questions of why we were doing things that we were doing, and working with some phenomenal senior executives to think through healthcare, but then also starting 2 corporate venture funds that enabled us to invest in companies that were solving problems that we could then be the clients for, and remain very close to that team. And so I got to go inside Lafayette General, and I worked there for a 6-year period up until the time that we moved to South Carolina, and I still worked now Auctioner Lafayette General as an employee. I took a year hiatus. I wanted to see what it was going to be like to work in another health system. And this one was here locally in South Carolina. And respectfully, they hired me as the executive vice president of innovation. And I knew something was wrong was when I got that title, and that was what my contract said, and I got inside the health system, they immediately told me that they couldn't have it as executive vice president of innovation. So they turned it into the executive director and vice president of innovation. right there and then, that led me to believe that my dyad partner that I was assigned to within this job, and again, it was a job, not a contract. You know, it just showed me the culture of the organization and how it bared itself.
And with that, part one of our interview with Cian Robinson is going to come to a close. We will continue this conversation in part two.